decided to challenge this play. He has tossed down the red flag.
Don't forget they have to have good reason to overturn the official's decision.
After review the play, the ruling on the field stands as called. Touchdown.
Hey guys, welcome to After Further Review, our series where we look at some verses that often maybe get taken out of context or misapplied, those kind of things. I'm here in my garage because I wanted to do a little bit of work on my bike and take my bike out for a little bit because we're supposed to be getting potentially a large amount of snow over the next couple of days, and thought this might be the last chance to get my bike out. I am not much of a bike rider by any means. What Steve did a couple of years ago in taking his bike from New Mexico and riding through the mountains all the way to Wyoming still just confounds my mind to think about. I am not an endurance athlete by any stretch of the imagination. But if I had really wanted to do that with him, could I have taken a verse like Philippians 4, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength? Could I have just had that in my mind and gotten through that trip, even though I've never done any kind of training for it whatsoever, and I'm not even very good on a bike, or any number of other, grand things that I would want to accomplish? Could I just have that verse in mind and pray that verse, God, I can do this with your strength. I can do it. I knew a friend, knew a guy in high school who, before every free throw shot, he would recite that verse in his mind. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, and take his free throw. Is that what that verse is talking about? Or have we, in our culture, for the most part, taken that verse out of context to mean something that Paul had no intention of conveying? I think a lot of us understand the context of this verse and probably get it, but I did want to just take a very brief look at what's going on, what I think Paul meant to convey for us and what we should get out of this verse. It's apparent in several places in Philippians that they have sent him this large monetary gift while he's in prison in Ephesus. They send Epaphroditus with a big sum of money, which is a pretty substantial blessing when you're in prison in those days, because nobody took care of you. The prisons were not obliged in any way to take care of your everyday needs. You had to depend on other people and the benevolence and hospitality of sometimes total strangers or family or friends to come to the prison and give you those daily necessities. So they send Epaphroditus down with this large monetary gift for Paul. And in chapter 4, Paul thanks them 3 times and conveys his appreciation to them. But then he says something, it just seems very rude what he says. Basically, he says, thank you, but I really wasn't asking for this money. I wasn't looking for it. And honestly, I don't even really need it. Nobody would say that to somebody who came such a long way or got, sacrificed so much of their own means to provide for you, especially when you are in dire situation like prison and you're suffering. Why in the world would Paul say something like that? It seems very rude. Well, there were philosophers in his day, in Philippi and Ephesus and elsewhere, particularly Stoic philosophers, right, teaching Stoicism, and they would go about dispensing their teachings and their wisdom in public places with maybe a large audience gathered around to listen to them, and maybe they might even have their own posse of followers or disciples. And then you had, debates. They would even have debates between this philosophy and that philosophy. This was very common in Athens, as you know, and that was what Mars Hill, the Areopagus was all about philosophies dueling and battling one another, and you have this philosopher against this philosopher. Well, that sounds very similar to what Paul did. What Paul, every day of Paul's life was going to public places or tabernacles, but he was going to these places and dispensing, giving the gospel, right? Evangelizing to groups of people, and sometimes even debating other philosophers or other teachers or Jewish leaders, whoever it might be, about what the purpose of life really actually is, and the nature of God. So there was their way of life, both these philosophers and what Paul was doing, could perhaps look very similar at times. And so Paul makes a point never to accept money, because the philosophers did accept money, and they required payment for debating and for going to public places and giving out their wisdom or their knowledge. And Paul he's very adamant to the Corinthians and other people, says, yes, I have a right, as an evangelist, to accept money or to even ask for money. I make it a point not to, because I don't want to be a burden on any of you. But I think really he doesn't want to be confused with those philosophers, and he doesn't want their teaching and his teaching to look the same at all, or for people to dismiss Paul on account of looking like those philosophers. And but Paul is very adamant that the Philippians understand that Paul's joy is in no way dependent upon this money or this gift that they've sent, which might allow him, any notion of physical comfort. Paul, I think, wants the Philippians to understand that he's thankful, but his joy wasn't dependent upon that gift. Paul says, I have learned to be content in any situation, whether it's having nothing or having a lot of things. In his day, Stoic philosophers, they would use that word contentment, the word that we translate into contentment in English, as essentially they would use that word to mean what we mean by self-sufficiency. Having everything you need within yourself and not being dependent on anything or anyone to get by. And it's interesting that Paul would have agreed with these philosophers on a couple of main points. One of them being that when you're going through suffering and difficult times, that does not mean that you are cursed by God, or that means some kind of spiritual disaster in some way. Both the philosophers and Paul would have agreed on that point. They also would have agreed on the opposite point, that having physical comfort and having amassed a lot of material possessions and money and riches and that kind of thing, that does not mean that you are successful. That is not the definition of success for Stoic philosophers or for Paul. Now, where they would have diverged on their teachings is that whereas the Stoic philosophers would say you can have that strength to get through those difficult times when you don't have anything, you can find that strength within yourself. Self-sufficiency is like the greatest attribute that you could aspire to have, to not be dependent on yourself or anyone else or any God. And Paul's point is very much the opposite. He says, yes, whereas you can have joy even when you don't have possessions or physical comfort, and no, it doesn't mean that you are successful or blessed if you have a lot, but that strength to get through difficult times, particularly and suffering, doesn't come from within yourself, doesn't come from within me. All of it comes from God. The joy and the strength to get through those times comes from God, not myself. I think Paul would say, he would want the Philippians to know that the struggles that he considers actual struggles can't be fixed with money, because dealing with those physical discomforts, to Paul, it's an inconvenience, but it wasn't a huge deal for him, because his life, his perspective was much greater than just material possessions, what was right in front of his eyes. And so it's in this context that Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. It's not his own strength. It didn't come from within himself. And it was something that he did have to learn and to grow in, not something that he was magically, imbued with. But the greatest strength of all, and I hope I'm not overstating it, but I think one of the greatest strengths there is the strength that is found in contentment. Contentment in any number of situations, which Paul learned and Paul had. I think it's important for us today to realize we are not owed anything. We don't deserve anything. If God takes away everything in my life, my health, my house, my family, everything, or the world takes it away, it doesn't make any of those things any less than the blessing that they were intended to be in my life. All those things were still blessings, and my life itself was still a blessing, because I wasn't owed or deserved any of that to begin with. It was all a gift. But I think Paul would have somewhat echoed the words of Proverbs 30, where it says, give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. Some other verses that come to mind are John 15, where Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So in a sense, when we say, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, well, all my strength came from Christ anyway, so everything that I have accomplished in my life is because of Christ in the first place. So in a sense, that interpretation of the passage is true. Anything that I could do comes from Christ because it was him who gave me my strength and my breath. But 2 Corinthians 12, God tells Paul, my power is made perfect in weakness, right? Paul asks God for something and God essentially says, no, my power is made perfect in weakness. I think that is a passage, that's a chapter to really chew on when we talk about contentment. And then 1 Timothy, Paul says, 1 Timothy chapter 6, but godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. And then he talks about the trap that money and riches can often be for a lot of people who chase that. Is it somehow bad or evil to present requests to God, even when it's things that we might just really want? When we're going through difficult times or times of suffering and feel like something might really help that God could offer, God could provide, is it a sin or is it bad to ask God for those things? And Paul would say absolutely not. In fact, he told them, present your requests to God, and the God of peace will be with you. God doesn't promise that he will answer every request or give us everything that we ask for or anything that we ask for, except for when it is in his name, when it is in I guess, accordance with what Christ himself might ask and pray for. When we align ourselves with that, then we can have the kind of peace that passes understanding. But to learn and grow in contentment, I think Paul would say, yes, present all your requests to God, but I hope that your number one request is for contentment in your life, whether you have much or whether you have little. And I think if we desire contentment above anything else, I think that God will give that to us. That's an amazing gift to have, the contentment that comes from God. I think it's one of the greatest gifts that we could have. So if I can offer just a rephrase of Philippians 4:13, I would offer something like this: God will give me all the strength I need to accomplish what he has called me to do. He's called all of us to important things, sometimes very, very difficult things, and sometimes even to suffer. He tells the Philippians back in chapter 1, "For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake." So I just pray that God would give us all the conviction that suffering with Christ and suffering for Christ is a blessed life, and that there's no such thing as prospering outside of a life in Christ, no matter how much you have. God will strengthen and empower you to do those things, especially when we're called to suffer. He will give you the strength to get through that. So speaking of contentment, we mentioned 2 Corinthians chapter 12 just a minute ago, where God tells Paul, "My power is made perfect in weakness." Well, what was the request? What was Paul asking for? If you remember, he's asking God to take away this thorn in the flesh. I've heard a lot of different things about what that could mean. So that is going to be Jeff's assignment for next week. Jeff, what in the world is Paul talking about? What was his thorn in the flesh? And why is he bringing up this conversation and this request that he had before God to the Corinthian church? You guys have a blessed rest of your week. See you later.
And the coach has decided to challenge this play. He has tossed down the red flag.
Don't forget they have to have good reason to overturn the official's decision.